Every single long-running series will have something that is misinterpreted, then is picked up by a part of the community, and is just repeated for long enough that it becomes something that everyone has read somewhere. Yes, I am the guy who will unironically ask you for a source. I've been on the internet for long enough that I know half of the things that are canon are actually just made up, so stop bullying me. The Walking Dead is no exception, so being the Walking Dead retrospective man who hasn't actually finished the retrospective, I thought I'd do my part in at least clearing up a few of these misconceptions, and then people can hopefully reference this video later on, because I'm sure this will finally put all of these myths to rest. I am sure of this. They won't, but at least you'll know what happened. Right from the get-go, we have to talk about the timeline of the series, because this is something that a lot of people just refuse to accept for some reason. The entire story, up to the end of Season 8, where Negan is defeated, is roughly 2 to 3-ish years. Yes, Carl is canonically 14 years old when the Savior War ends. Yes, it doesn't make any sense with Chandler being like 17 or 18 by that point, but yes, canonically, he is supposed to be just a few years older than when we started. The biggest reason for it seeming very weird is that only the first couple of seasons had major time jumps. Season 2 to 3 skipped the winter time, and Season 3 to 4 also skipped the winter time. Everything else happens basically back to back to back to back. Like, for example, there are like 2 months between Season 4 and their arrival at Alexandria. And if you want to look even closer, Season 4 ends and Season 5 opens on the same day. Season 6 and Season 7 obviously flow together because it's the Negan scene, and Season 7 to 8 also doesn't have any downtime because, well, it's wartime. So basically everything after the prison is like this one major block leading up to the end of the Negan story when we get a whole bunch of time jumps. The comics obviously never had this weird, goofy situation where only a few years had passed, but every single actor is like 8 years older because, well, you know, they're not exactly real people. But it is just an oddity when it comes to working with shows like this. And because I've seen countless Reddit threads about this where people still say that no, that can't be right, the easiest point of reference in this entire series is just Laurie's pregnancy. Naturally, there must be 9 months between Season 1 and Season 3 that is already post the winter time skip. And from that point on, there really isn't much wiggle room to argue about time passing off screen, because again, everything after that is just one major story that leads to a very obvious time jump that is explicitly vocalized. And on a somewhat similar note, I guess let's get right to the big one. Carl's death and all the copium-filled narratives around his departure from the show. Kirkman is absolutely an author who challenges established storytelling conventions and deliberately messes around with his readers. But Carl is kind of an exception to that rule. As I think basically everyone expected, Carl does eventually become the series lead in the comic book. The Walking Dead is meant to be a story of humanity in an unforgiving and ruthless world. But it is also a story of beginning to rebuild society from the ground up. So with Carl being that signifier of the next generation, killing him off would be like the antithesis of the entire story, wouldn't it? Yeah, well, let's drop the suspense. That's exactly what the show did. The TV series already had a pretty mixed reputation of it sometimes doing things just for shock value and nothing else. But for big parts of the audience, this was the final nail in the coffin. And because of just how nonsensical this decision was, many people immediately started coming up with explanations to just try and make it make sense. And so, the most common narrative became that Chandler Riggs actually wanted to leave the show because he wanted to go to college. And I have no other way to put it than that just being, like, completely made up. First of all, Chandler quite literally bought a house to make filming easier, which obviously turned out to be a waste of money. Secondly, his parents roasted Gimple for basically betraying Chandler's trust, saying they never trusted him, but he did. I mean, I think all of us know that when parents start roasting someone for disrespecting their kids, it's the real deal. Thirdly, this decision, and I quote, came from myself and the writers. The myself there, of course, being Gimple. With it also noting that it, quote, has nothing to do with real life in any way. And finally, this also wasn't Kirkman wanting to tell a drastically different story than he originally did, as, again, Gimple explicitly addresses the question about Kirkman by stating that this is their own decision with no input from Kirkman. I don't think that question needed to be answered because, like, again, Carl is supposed to be the future of the franchise. And that also isn't surprising because Kirkman was literally involved with lawsuits against AMC, and more on that in a second. But yes, he was killed off and fired as a result. Plain and simple. As for why he was killed off, a prominent theory is him turning 18 and now requiring an adult contract, which could be negotiated for a pretty sizable sum considering he'd become the series lead. Personally though, I think it had a whole lot more to do with ego and trying to prove that they know better than the original author. I'll just throw up this quote by George R. R. Martin, who, unfortunately, faced a very similar fate with his adaptation. No, but like seriously, what are the odds of these two massive media juggernauts being completely messed up by random writers deciding they know better than the author? Why? Why do they keep doing this? The only reason they have a job in the first place is because the original author wrote it. Why do they think they know better? And on a similar note, a quick thing I want to dispel is the notion that the TV series is just a live-action version of the comic book. I still often see people thinking that it's like a manga to anime situation with only minor differences, but yeah, no. Many ask if they can just switch over to the comic at a certain point, and while you could probably make sense of the differences, the show is drastically different from the books, even by seasons 2 and 3. Shane's arc is very different, Andrea's arc is completely different, Michonne's arc is completely different, Merle and Daryl don't even exist in the book, Tyrese's arc is completely different, Carol's arc is completely different, and the differences just keep on piling on and on and on, and obviously compounding over time. After a certain point, they might as well be different stories with just the same setting. It is kind of uncanny when you think about it. So yes, if you enjoyed the show, you should absolutely read the book, because unlike the TV series with its constantly changing showrunners and visions, the comic is just like consistently good, and with a single thesis statement all throughout. Every character gets a logical conclusion to their story, and it's not like they left, they were randomly killed off, none of that. It's just a consistent story with consistent characters that is consistently good. Also, no one has infinite ammo, no one sails across the Atlantic Ocean, and no one has plot armor. I was gonna say thicker than steel, but I think in this case I should just say Daryl and Carol, because apparently their plot armor is like way thicker than steel. Another thing the comic is consistent with are the walkers. Except Kirkman accidentally called them zombies a few times, but ignore that. In Season 1, we saw a number of smart/special walkers that still had some remnants of memories/intelligence left. Summer picked up the teddy bear, Morgan's wife Jenny turned the doorknob, one of the walkers was using a rock to bash through the window, and some were straight up climbing the fences in Atlanta. But right after Season 1, they just up and vanished, spurring on the widespread belief that it happens because their brains are decaying. This is pure fan canon that has been complicated by AMC retconning things 15 different times and unironically gaslighting viewers, but let's unpack this. The real reason for them just disappearing is Darabont, the original showrunner, leaving the show. For more info on that, check out my pilot video and the Season 2 Walking Dead retrospective. But in short, it was purely a creative decision to accentuate certain character narratives. In the comic book, there are walkers that either sit or walk around, but nothing about them signals intelligence, nor is something like intelligence ever even entertained with the walkers. All of this was purely for TV and purely because of Darabont. As for the whole brain decay theory, that doesn't actually make much sense either. There are people turning all the time, and fresh walkers would exhibit some kind of intelligence, but they never do. What complicates matters is that the show completely forgets about them past Season 1, because again, Darabont left, but then, more than a decade later, they have Aaron just randomly mention that he has heard stories of them. Which, yeah, that is just a blatant retcon. The reason for the retcon, I think, is a classic Walking Dead pseudo-false promise, because they never do anything important in Season 11, but more importantly, there is a spin-off, Daryl Dixon, that will supposedly delve into the origins of the virus in France. Please keep watching, please keep subscribed. Basically what I'm saying is, this entire Smart Walker thing is them being retconned out, and then them being retconned back in, with the real reason simply being showrunners changing. The original vision for the TV show's Infected was Romero's zombies, but after that, they aligned back with the comic book of just basic slow walkers and that's it. And eventually, some kind of infected that with special abilities and stuff were retconned back in. Having Aaron mention that he's heard stories of them is like hilarious though, like wow, we've been watching this entire show, not once has that ever been entertained, no one's ever talked about those weird walkers who were doing special things, but suddenly he just starts yapping about it. A bit of a fan favorite that, I admit, I also really liked is Morgan supposedly having met the Whisperers.
I am! People wearing dead people's faces! Morgan, listen.
And unfortunately, that did not happen. It's a very funny coincidence that the Whisperer story was just starting out in the comic book when the episode aired, but in the TV universe, the timeline just doesn't add up. Gimple also very explicitly confirmed that predates his knowledge of them. So it's not like Kirkman was giving them notes of stuff that is yet to happen and wanting to set something up. No, Morgan was just yapping and that's it. You have to admit though, it's like a really cool line. But alright, we talked about Carl or Chandler Riggs who didn't want to leave the show. Now let's do a quick-fire round of all the actors who actually wanted to leave the show and were either killed off or written out as a result. First up is Jesus or Tom Paine. He wanted to leave the show because he just felt like he never got anything to do, especially with how much training was required for the role. If you're not familiar with the comic story, yeah, saying Jesus was mishandled in the show is like the understatement of the century. Ever since like season 3, Daryl overshadowed basically every single right hand Rick was supposed to have, and Jesus was no exception. And so yes, he just didn't really enjoy his time on the show and wanted to leave, and was killed off as a result. Also, bonus fact, when I talk about Daryl overshadowing sort of Rick's right hands, that applies to everyone. Tyrese is like a huge example of that, Jesus is another massive example of that, Andrea and Michonne are both very different characters, but both of them are very important, and the list goes on. Daryl basically takes the stories of like a dozen different characters, just because people liked him. And sort of a similar situation also happened with Lenny James, or Morgan. He was brought back in season 6, or technically season 5. He then had his whole arc of going back and forth between his clear persona and the all life is precious Morgan, but eventually they considered that his arc is essentially done. But instead of just killing him off or writing him out of the show, they thought that Fear the Walking Dead has a comparatively small cast, and Morgan, a lot of people like Morgan, so they just moved him over to Fear. I do remember that there were rumors about Lenny James supposedly also saying that he feels like he doesn't really have anything to do in The Walking Dead, and that's why he chose to go over to Fear, but those are rumors. I don't really think those are true. He has said that the decision to go over to Fear was his decision, but I don't really know if that was dissatisfaction or just thinking that, you know what, I'm gonna get my own show. The reason why I say it's similar, but also not really, is because Morgan's story was already done in the comics. Most of what happened with him and Alexandria, and really most of his story now that I think about it, is entirely TV exclusive. So to sum it up, him moving over to Fear is kind of a meta thing, but also kind of a story thing because Morgan's story was already done. And to be fair, that does make a lot of sense. The season 9 to 11 cast is extremely bloated. Next up, we have Maggie, or Lauren Cohen. Her being written out has got to be up there with some of the worst writing in the entire series. Like, do you remember the big book of plot and the completely random Georgie encounter where Maggie just goes off on an adventure later on? Yeah, I don't either because it wasn't very good. But in reality, she just got a lead role in Whiskey Cavalier, which obviously paid more than AMC, and so she left the show. It was eventually cancelled and she decided to return to The Walking Dead and eventually got her own spin-off. So that entire awkward period where she was just written out for seemingly no reason is just AMC hoping that she would eventually return to the show, but if she didn't, then, well, you know, it would have been very, very awkward indeed. And, speaking of which, she wasn't actually the first to start this trend of clumsily writing out characters with the hopes that they eventually return. The first one was actually Heath, or Corey Hawkins. He literally just up and vanished in the middle of an episode, and all we got was a classic Walking Dead quote-unquote mystery with the PPP card, which, yes, is still a nonsensical connective symbol with the CRM that was supposedly going to be some great mythology that either never came or will still arrive in probably like 5 years when they decide to announce another CRM thing of some kind. And if not, then, you know, PPP, mystery. But yes, Corey Hawkins got a lead role and just never returned, leaving us with just the showrunner note that he was apparently captured. Heath started this weird trend where AMC was sort of afraid to commit and lose actors, and so they just clumsily wrote them out hoping that they would return, which in this case he never did, but at the same time, they also killed Carl, so I never really got what the rationale was, like when the actors wanted to leave. I don't know why they didn't just kill them off, but yeah, he just wanted to leave. On a very similar note, Denai Guerrera, or Michonne, got a role in the Marvel Universe, and so she too went after the big bag. She was written out with the hope that she would return for the Rick movie trilogy that obviously never happened, and eventually became The Ones Who Live. So if you ever agreed with me in thinking that it makes no sense for Michonne to leave her children behind in search of some miracle that Rick is still alive, then yes, you are kind of right because she was just written out. And speaking of Rick, or Andrew Lincoln, he wanted to spend more time with family, and so he too was written out. But not before securing a absolutely massive bag, big W's to Andy. The only funny thing with the whole Andrew Lincoln departure is of course the movie trilogy that was always teased as Rick's big return and it never happened, so I would be very curious to find out what was going on behind the scenes. Like, how close were they to just losing Rick completely? And as a bonus fact, Chandler has also spoken about how the death of Carl was likely a major factor in him finally deciding to leave. Those are of course hypotheticals, as he had been talking about leaving ever since like season 4, but hey, it does line up timeline-wise. Andrew had also gotten very close with Chandler while he was growing up on sets, and I don't think it makes much sense for Chandler to lie about something like this many years after it happened, so personally, I do think that might have been a factor. Yet another actor who wanted to leave was way back in the day in Season 2 with Jeffrey Demun or Dale. He wanted to be killed off because he thought that AMC had done wrong by Darabont and didn't agree with his firing. If you've seen Darabont's other work, you'll know that he does have certain actors who sort of stick with him throughout basically all projects, and Jeffrey Demun is one of them. Hello, this is Editing Korotos. I literally just saw this on Reddit, so there is one more person I need to clear up. Sophia's death is not the actress wanting to leave the show. In the comic book, she never dies. She is there all throughout the entire series, right alongside Carl. In the TV show, she died in Season 2, but all of that was a story decision and nothing more. In an interview back in 2020, Madison Lynch very explicitly says that her parents getting the call that she would in fact be killed off was a big surprise. With that said, back to past Korotos. As far as I know, this is the complete list of all the notable departures. Everyone else, yes, including Carl, was killed off for purely story reasons, and that's it. And as a follow-up, let's run through all the behind-the-scenes drama that has also been a source of a bunch of misinformation. Talking about Darabont's firing, the stated reason was that he got very, very nasty with the rest of the creative team. Something that can't really be argued with because all of it has been made public, and it involved bricks, so it was pretty intense. But a large factor in it getting very intense was AMC slashing the budget for Season 2 despite the success of Season 1 and Season 2 being longer. People often attribute the issues of Season 2 to just Darabont's firing. But the premiere, for example, had to be entirely rewritten, like mid-production. The rest of the season was also made on a comparatively tiny budget, and I think it does show, so the real villain there is just AMC executives. If you want to see the full Darabont letter, I talk about it in the Season 2 retrospective video, but let's just say I can totally see why he got fired because it's funny, but I feel like nowadays it'd be a bit more publicized than just getting fired from the show because it was pretty bad. After Darabont though, Glenn Mazzara became the showrunner through to the end of Season 3. But with him too, wouldn't you know it, there were disagreements with the executives. Nowadays, and this is also true for me personally, Mazzara does have a bit of a mixed reputation among fans, mostly because of how they handled Andrea's death. But the pacing and structure of Season 3 is what The Walking Dead would have been with him at the helm. Season 3, despite some pretty big problems I have with it, is still my favorite season ever, so you know what, I think I would have enjoyed it. If you dig into old interviews with Mazzara, he makes it very clear that he has a good idea of where the show might end. Something that is definitely backed up by Season 3 that blazed through the comic material at such a rate that they'd be caught up in like 3 to 4 years tops. If you talk about material actually adapted, nothing in the entire Walking Dead run comes even close to the pacing of Season 3. Purely going by the numbers, there are some seasons that seem deceptively fast. But they're not really because they're just skipping entire volumes. Season 3 is, by miles, the most content that has ever been adapted into a single season. Thing is, Season 3 is when The Walking Dead was popping off. And so, executives must not have wanted to lose their cash cow, and so Mazzara too was replaced. Which brings us to today. We are in 2025 with almost the same number of episodes as comic book issues and a dozen spin-offs. So really, the show could never really find a consistent vision because AMC just never allowed it to. And what certainly didn't help matters is that Darabont, the original showrunner, Kirkman, the author of the entire franchise, Galen Hurd, the executive producer of the show, Glenn Mazzara, and a number of other executive producers all tried suing AMC. We're not going to get into it because it's just boring profit-sharing stuff, but that is, most likely, why Kirkman just disappeared from the TV show altogether. The last ever episode he officially has any involvement in is in Season 5. And as far as I know, the last time he's talked about the AMC franchise is when he said that he would have to get the rights back from AMC to do an animated series, so I don't think he's particularly interested in what they're cooking. As for Darabont, he won the lawsuit and was paid out a whole bunch of money. Importantly though, he would also be paid residuals from The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. Now, just to be clear, this is speculation on my part, but I think that is also a big contributing factor for why both of the main shows were wrapped up and new spin-offs started in their place. Those would not be covered by the lawsuit and would not have to pay out residuals. They can make a separate show called The Walking Dead: The Return of Rick Grimes. But if they make The Walking Dead Season 12, they immediately have to pay out residuals, which I assume they don't want to do. And finally, there is Gimple's quote-unquote firing. After the mass outcry over the butchering of the All Out War story and the death of Carl in Season 8, news broke that Gimple would be replaced by Angela Kang as showrunner. Thing is, unlike the previous showrunners that were actually fired, he was not fired, he was actually promoted to manage the entire franchise. So while yes, Season 9 and onward was a new creative vision, it didn't really stop the weirdly written mysteries that are not even mysteries since they lead nowhere, because the entire franchise, and especially the connection between the shows, were now overseen by Gimple. Also, just to be clear, I've talked like a lot of negative things about Gimple, but I don't actually think he's like Voldemort or anything. There's actually a lot of stuff I really like in Season 4 and 5 from Gimple, and Season 6 too, so yeah. Gimple is not Voldemort. He's done a lot of weird things, but I do think the Walking Dead fandom does kind of blow it out of proportion. That said, I still think the Carl death is like a huge ego problem and they should have never done it. No, you can't write it better than Kirkman. Stop it. A quick fun little debate is the fate of Rick's hand in the comic book as well as the show. In the book, Rick loses a hand extremely early in their first run-in with the governor, something that clearly never happened in the show. From a practical point of view, the biggest reason was having to CG Rick's hand in every single episode and every single scene, and he is the series lead. That would be very costly to do. And keep in mind, this was still in the golden age of TV when we got like 16 episodes every single year, not 7 episodes every 3 decades. So yes, it never happened in the show, until it kinda did, but that doesn't count because they just like put a weird glove over it and it's not really missing an arm and it doesn't really change anything. With the comic though, Kirkman has gone back and forth many times about whether or not it was the right call. Back in 2014, both Kirkman and Andrew Lincoln campaigned for Rick to lose his hand. But again, they were just said that it would cost a fortune and that was the end of that. So clearly, Kirkman still thought that it was a good idea. But at the same time, Kirkman has also talked about how it made writing the comic book kind of weird at times because of just basic practical things. For example, how is he going to reload a gun one-handed? It was a comic, sure, but the internal logic of the series was still hard to maintain when he was supposed to be running around and fighting. How are you going to depict a scene of him sitting down and opening a can? Even something as small as him buttoning up a shirt. These kinds of things just became like unnecessarily hard. So it seems like Kirkman might have also thought that it happened a bit too early. But then again, in 2018, he also said that he still regrets that Rick never lost his hand in the TV show, so who knows. Back in season 3 to 4 days at least, it definitely seems like they always wanted to do it, but practical filmmaking was just a big roadblock. Which, by the way, is exactly why we need an accurate animated adaptation of the comic book. 0 changes unless they are explicitly signed off by Kirkman from the comic book. Just adapt the book. Do not make changes. That is what the show already did. We don't need another weird redundant adaptation. Just adapt the book. Next up, let's talk about the virus itself. In the show, it even has a fancy name of Wildfire and everything, but naturally, people have always wondered where it came from, what it even is, and generally, what's the deal with the virus? The TV universe is now exploring that, and it supposedly comes from France. The comic, on the other hand, never touches basically any science regarding the virus because it just clashes with the vision of The Walking Dead. Kirkman's entire purpose of writing The Walking Dead was to create a story with no solution. Every other story seemed to end with a cure or being saved or whatever else. This story was meant to be an answer to that. Instead of trying to just neatly fix the problem, it instead focused exclusively on how people survived and learned to thrive in this broken world. But again, people are people, and they kept nagging Kirkman, and so one day, he just responded with Space Spore. Now, bear with me here, there is a definitive end to this story. But before we get to that, let's have a fun little history lesson. The Walking Dead is actually a bit of a Trojan horse when it comes to weird space alien stuff. When Kirkman first pitched the comic book series, the premise of a zombie apocalypse was apparently too boring. And so, instead of giving up, he just made up some bogus lore about how the zombies are actually just a ruse and that the real threat are the aliens. And wouldn't you know it, the series actually got greenlit. Obviously, there is in fact no aliens in The Walking Dead, so a few issues in, Kirkman had to come clean, but the series was already proving successful, and so it didn't get pulled or anything. It is kind of funny to think about how back in like 2002 and 3, aliens must have actually been more popular than zombies. That's kind of wild to think about. I honestly wish we got more shows like Falling Skies or something where aliens were actually the threat. It feels like it's zombies 24/7 nowadays. But anyway, point being, The Walking Dead did have very goofy space connections, so some begin to wonder whether that is an actual legit response. It's vague enough to not be destructive to the series' vision, and it's also kind of foolproof. When people ask what it is, you can just say Space Spore and that's it. What else is there to say? It's just a space spore. In reality though, it was nothing more than a joke. Most likely, it was just a small nod to the Romero zombies where a weird space probe explosion thingy is also hypothesized to be the origin of the virus. So yes, in the Walking Dead mythos, no one knows about the origin of the virus or what it even really is. I can't wait for the TV series to get the very unique idea of it being A fungus, or B, a weird flower found underground. No, that is not The Last of Us, and no, it's not Resident Evil. And the final thing that isn't really a myth, but more so people not being aware of it, the fate of the Vaatos. In the show, we last see them geared up with Rick's guns, and that's it. We just part ways. But in Season 2, there is actually a deleted scene where, after the explosion of the CDC, Rick's group seeks for shelter and returns to the Vaatos. When they arrive, however, no one is left. All the people have been shot in the head, and the place is overrun by walkers, clearly implying that they must have been attacked. The full 13-minute deleted scene is on YouTube and might be a remnant of the previous Season 2 script, but who knows. People have further speculated that they might have been attacked by the governor or something along those lines, but there has been no other lore confirming anything one way or another. Personally, I think the scene was a very powerful reminder of how dangerous the world was and that things are happening constantly even if we don't see them, so it is kinda sad that it was cut, but it is what it is. Point is, we do know the fate of the Vaatos, and they are dead. In terms of common myths / misunderstandings / questions, I think that just about covers it. If there's anything I missed, drop a comment and maybe I'll put together another one of these. If you watch the retrospective, I think you know very well that I love talking about these little lore bits surrounding the series and how certain real-world circumstances might have affected what happened. And that's the video. Been quite some time since we've talked about all the drama surrounding like Season 2 and 3, so it's very fun for me to talk about that all over again. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Seth MM and Stefan Woodhouse. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!